and I'm the editor of AD, but I also edit a book list at John Wiley, and I've been very lucky to work with Grahame Shane here for about 7 or 8 years. And about 5 years ago, I had a chat with Grahame. I think I went over to see him in New York, and I started to persuade him that he might like to do another book after Recombinant Urbanism. And he was a little bit reticent at first, but he did agree. And the result of my persuasion is urban design since 1945. And it's very gratifying when someone agrees to do a project that you persuade them into. But it's even more amazing when they finish it and it's published and it comes out. But with Grahame, it's particularly poignant because he was at the AA in the late 60s when he graduated, and he's really dedicated his life to teaching architecture. And if you have ever met Grahame before, you know that as a teacher, he is someone who not only is interested in teaching, but he's interested in learning about his students' experiences, their urban experiences. And a lot of the book was researched through his students. And just visiting worldwide cities, and I think he slept on a lot of students' floors and couches, or ex-students' floors and couches, and the result is the book. So thank you, Grahame, and thanks to all his ex-students, but also thanks to Mike Weinstock, who's another author on the list and an AD board member, and he's agreed to contribute this evening. So thank you.
I am apparently going to chair this discussion panel, and before that I'll give a few words of introduction. My name is Colin Fournier. I teach down the road up the road at the Bartlett, and I'm happy to see that some of my students are here tonight. So I'd like to create situations when the two schools finally reconcile and talk to each other. 2 days ago, Grahame gave me, for my birthday, this extraordinary book called City Metaphors by Matthias Ungers, which I think you got from the bookstore here, the bookshop here at the AA, which is an incredible book because it is about city metaphors. And that is the most appropriate analogy that I could make with his own book. I feel that his own book, which I have a copy of here, Urban Design since 1945, is indeed itself a city metaphor. And in many ways, for those of you who actually know his book on recombinant urbanism, the major theory that Grahame developed in that book, the fact that the city is made of 3 major components, the armatures and the enclaves and the heterotopias, is in fact the way this book is made also. So in a way it's a metaphor of his own theory. And I find that quite an extraordinary fact. I find that for those of you who will read this book, you will see, and this is what I want to talk about briefly before he starts, because last time we saw a book presentation here that I attended, which I forget what the book was now. The book itself was hardly spoken about. We were entered into a discussion before the really substance of the book was addressed. And this time we will actually, because Michael will speak about it, and I will speak about it briefly, we will have some attempt, and so will Grahame. We will have some material to get our teeth into for the discussion. But I just want to say briefly that indeed the book has got all the 3 components of a city as Grahame has identified them. It is actually an enclave, clearly in itself, because between its 2 covers, this hard copy I've got, between the two covers, you've got 360 pages of very condensed material, which represents clearly an enclave, something that is protected from the outside. But it also contains a number of enclaves. It contains 4 major chapters, which correspond to the 4 stages of the evolution of the city, which Grahame has identified. It also is an armature in itself, and it contains a number of armatures. The armature that it follows appears to be chronological. It's a sequence of events of the city between 1945 and now, but actually it's slightly deceptive because that armature is not purely chronological. It proceeds chronologically, but it has a reverse order chronology working too, and it has other structures mixed up with it. So I think it's interesting because it's a rhizomic structure, and a structure that is in a way similar to what Grahame identifies as the contemporary structure, contemporary architecture, armature of a city. And I find that a very interesting analogy. In a way, it's like an extended armature. It's like Grand Central Station with rail lines going in all directions and then being prolonged by digital armatures. It is also, in a sense, an armature which is on the edge of chaos, as the complexity theory says, because it doesn't have quite enough structure to be void of the ability to change and evolve, but it has enough structure to not be completely entropic. So it's a very strange situation of an armature that's there and not there at the same time. And of course, it also contains heterotopias. The book itself is a heterotopia, and it contains a number of singularities within it, which are themselves heterotopias. In other words, agents of change, which are not part of the norm of a city as we know it. So as you read the book, basically you understand what the city is about. And you don't understand what the city is about by reading the book, the content of the book, but you understand it intuitively because of the structure of the book itself. And I find that quite a tour de force, actually, quite a strange thing. You don't realize that holding the book, you're actually holding a city. You're holding an ideal city because it's so compact and contains all other cities. In the introduction to the previous book, which I made at the Bartlett 6 years ago, I think it was 6 years ago, I mentioned Jorge Luis Borges and his notion of the Aleph, the notion that there are certain points in the universe that contain all other points. And I said at the time that Grahame's first book was a theory that contains all other theories. It's a condensed theory that contains all theories. It contains the refutation of those theories and the refutation of the refutation. And in a sense, this book is another reenactment of this tour de force of an Aleph. I find that this book, in a way, contains all other books about cities. It's a city that contains all other cities. That's my reading of a city. When we introduced the book at the Bartlett about 4 months ago, I forget, I mentioned that there are what's extraordinary about the book is that it covers a very wide period of time. It covers 66 years, 2 generations. In fact, it's actually the lifetime of Grahame since he was born in 1945. And it's almost an impossible task to try and talk about the evolution of a city over such a long period of time and to talk about it worldwide. And Helen, in a sense, you really did present Grahame with an impossible undertaking, which he has pulled off, although in a sense, the strength and the weakness of the book lies in that. It's the weakness of the book to cover so much ground because, in a way, Grahame could only touch upon highlights of elements, but he's covered so many elements that it then becomes a guide towards all the things which have not been said. And it's the strength, of course, because there's nothing better than trying to really give you a comprehensive overview of the evolution of a city. Last time I mentioned that there were 10 shifts, there were 10 major changes in the city, which Grahame identifies in his book. I think it's 10 out of many, but I'll just very briefly mention them as key points. The first point is that during that period, the population has risen exponentially until we get to reach levels of 7 billion. So therefore, the presence of a city and the importance of a city has increased significantly during that period of time. The second one is that we have experienced a shift from the West, from European and Northern American models of a city to the South, to the East, and to the Far East. And that's been a very major change during that period. The third one is indeed the shifts in the forms of urban growth, the 4 forms which Grahame will talk about, which he has identified evolving from the metropolis to the current megacity and metacity. The fourth one is that we have seen an incredible shift from planned development, planned urbanism, to informal settlements. The fact that probably now almost 1/3, maybe even more, of urban growth worldwide is actually squatter settlements and informal settlements. And that is something which is very different from the situation which we had in 1945, where most of the at least recorded urban growth was essentially top-down and controlled development. The fifth one, and very important one, is that underlying the whole structure of the book is an analysis of the shifts in the sources of energy that the city is based on. Grahame clearly identifies that the metropolis, the original city form, was based on coal, and that the form of energy then shifted to oil and then subsequently to renewable energies, which is the sequence we're going through now. And this has had profound influences on the evolution which he describes in the book. The sixth one is the fact that during that period we have firmly understood the nature of climate change, the shift towards a situation where there's a growing desertification of the world on the one hand, as well as a risk of flooding on the other. And this will have and is beginning to have very significant effect on the location of cities and the form that cities will take and are taking. The seventh item, I'm almost done, is the shift towards digital, towards armatures which are actually digitally influenced. And so we're not just talking about railway armatures and roads, etc. We're talking about a shift to cyberspace. This is something which, of course, Bill Mitchell has covered very extensively in The City of Bits, but something which Grahame shows the growing change in the nature of armatures in his book. During that same period, we've seen, as we are very well aware of, a shift to capitalism towards a situation of crisis, again something that could not have been predicted in 1945. And the form of city, since cities are the expression of the dominant form of economic production of a time, the cities are profoundly affected and are being affected today as we speak by this crisis of capitalism. And the last two shifts that Grahame identifies in a very pertinent way in the book are the shift in warfare strategies, which in fact very much affected the shift from the metropolis to the megalopolis, which Paul Virilio always says we build cities the way we do war, we make war. It hasn't had quite the effect that we thought it might have. We thought at one point that the skyscrapers and the hyperdense city would eventually decentralize completely. It hasn't happened, but it's certainly an underlying phenomenon, the fear of the current forms of warfare and the vulnerability of the city as a result of that. And then the last one, and probably the most significant one in terms of the structure of the book, is the shift from a unified theory of urban design to an archipelago, which is his word, of many theories, conflicting philosophies, conflicting methodologies, which was very much the substance of the previous book, and one which he carries in his way of identifying the current contemporary city. These are the 10 major underlying currents and shifts over the 66 years that Grahame uses in his book, and which actually in a way inform the book in many different ways. The book, therefore, towards the end, is very much a collage. And for me, that reference to collage is important because it goes back to one of Grahame's first influences, the collage city of Colin Rowe, and the fact that this understanding of the deconstruction of the city of modernism, which was in a way our cultural base, is the main impulse which has led to an understanding of the city from a very much more complex angle and much more interesting angle. Interestingly enough, and Grahame probably doesn't know that, there's a book that was just published by Charles Jenks, which is called The Story of Postmodernism, which is also published by Helen, in which he actually devotes almost an entire chapter to your work and to and to heterotopias, which is quite an interesting phenomenon in the sense that he has found that a lot of the ideas which are at the root of postmodernism, not in terms of a style, but in terms of a philosophy of challenging the homogeneity of modernism, are in fact ideas which you have been working with and exploring. And this is quite a surprise to me, and probably is a surprise to you too. And I think that's all I need to say, really, as by means of introduction.
Wow. Well, I'm bowled over. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, AA. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Charlie, I guess. And it's really hard to follow your introduction. I think Colin has introduced me before, and he has such a clarity and directness about what he's doing. And when I'm working on things, there's such a muddle, and it's very refreshing to see things clearly and as they come back. And but I also this room has very many resonances for me. I presented my thesis here in 1969 to Peter Cook, Dalibor Vasily, Warren Chalk, the usual crew of fifth-year jurors at that time, including some savage Corbusians whose name I will not mention, who savaged my thesis. And so then there followed an amazing debate. And I know I have to talk about urban design since 1945 and its global thing, but I wanted to, just out of memory, to look at my thesis from 1979, 42 years ago. And to connect it to, it's just a kind of diversion, Helen, you don't have to worry. I will talk about the book too. But I wanted to connect it to when you do your thesis at the AA, you're sort of in a crazy creative frenzy, or you were in those days. And then here I am 42 years later at this tender age of 66, and I find that there's amazing themes that go through from then. So I'll come back to the book, but this was Gowan was my thesis tutor, and I worked in large format notebooks and did collages in the notebooks. And I found my thesis in the garage last summer and photographed it with my camera. And so, and it's still in quite good state. It's inside a plastic bag in this photograph, and I apologize for that. But if you look at it, I've got a model, urban model up there, who's actually Tyche of Athens, of Antioch. And then there's a whole kind of urban symbolism that links to ancient Rome. I have a matrix of urban actors in that right-hand side corner, and they're all in a kind of network working together. And then I'm mapping down from that to various urban elements that are on the ground plane of the city. And I also have the topo landscape of the two different hills and the bridge over the Walbrook and so on. And then I was obsessed with the Fleet River coming down from Hampstead and the one railway that crossed north-south across London in that valley, which is that whole area of Farringdon has been rebuilt since my thesis. And it's quite fantastic. And then Mount Pleasant is a development site under the latest plans. And King's Cross and St Pancras are major. I mean, it's pretty good for a kid. You know, I was like 23, not bad. And so, I don't know. This is Old Home Week, so that was one. There are themes in there about an armature maybe that comes down. There's this, I was obsessed with Mies and, when you're a student you muddle things up. Mies and Caen. So Mies was the ground plane and Caen was pavilions and on the ground plane. And I was obsessed with the idea of chess sets and urban actors. So I had this whole kind of metaphor of the city going that was also in this earlier drawing. The actors tie into the chess set, and there were certain types of moves that each type of actor could make inside the city and various urban elements. I was influenced by Rossi too. I knew about Rossi. But incidentally, I was very ecological. Food, if you look at the center there, bread, wine, and water and milk. Food was, I'm just joking, but you're not laughing. But food was very important, and so on. So, and then the city ground plane, and as the sort of basis for the city, and then these are the models that. They were rewiring England at that time with the third wire, so you didn't electrocute yourself. And so I thought there was a new city coming, and I was, influenced by archograms, Cedric Price. Roy Landau was very important for me as a student, and these were my teachers at the AA, and Alvin Boyarsky. So all of this in Chicago, and the layering of Chicago, And so all of this is coming into this city section with this new kind of public space in the center, this weird roof bubble, and then this very elaborate kind of Team 10 underground section. And, Rem was 2 years after me, so I was out there doing this stuff. And Peter Cook displayed my thesis behind the AA bar. It was the biggest honor you could have in those days. And I saw Richard Rogers and Foster closely inspecting it. Of course, they were way ahead, but it was just, for a kid, it was pretty interesting. I had jump jets, and I think they were nice drawings. And then I was trying to imagine the space inside the bubble with the three-dimensional layered city with this new public space. And the different urban actors who would use this urban equipment on the city ground plane. So that's just going sort of back in time. And when I started doing this book, I thought I would do a chronological survey and so on. But then I realized that it was impossible, and I developed the 4 models, and then they were like weather forces that went through the sort of global capitalism, global systems. And they sort of interfaced with each other and blended, and different urban actors in Singapore or in China or in Japan would use these urban models in different kinds of ways. So this climate change model, which is by Hansen, the guy who did the greenhouse gas studies very early on in the 1970s, it's what's interesting about it is that some places get hotter, some places get colder, and then it's the tension between this hot and cold that sets the dynamic in motion across the world. And I like to try and think of the urban models kind of working that way too. And it's not a uniform system, and it's not a uniform warming, and it's a very dynamic, patchwork-driven system. So it sort of goes beyond collage into a dynamic global system. And I like to think of the way the urban models move through with these fronts and their interaction and their overpowering and then their slowly erasure, disappearing later, as being a way of looking at how the city evolves and changes. And yet there is a kind of DNA that's inside these models as they travel that is in some ways is constant, but in other ways is constantly being adapted and changed. So this is a very important diagram for me, that it's static is kind of a problem, but it's meant to be dynamic. It's a metaphor for a dynamic urban system. So just skipping through this is really the structure of the book, and there's like 4 weather systems that go bowling around the urban universe. The most powerful one is the one right in the middle with the kind of atomic diagram of the mother city, the metropolis in the center, and then the ring of new towns like in Abercrombie's plan. But it's also the plan for Beijing, it's also the plan for Moscow. There's many variants. Hong Kong had a similar plan. It's a global pattern coming out of the New Town movement in Britain and being exported globally. And then I have along that line, this is actually, in a way, homage to Alvin Boyarsky's summer schools, which would have these threads that went through time and through the city, and then you wove the threads together to make a dynamic mixture. And so I'm taking that same idea and doing it with the idea of the metropolis, the idea of the megalopolis, which is really the car-based network city, and then the fragmented metropolis, when they found they couldn't manage the megalopolis, that there were so many administrative agents and governments involved and the original one was the east coast of America, that it was impossible to manage. Then you just shrank back to these smaller fragments that you could code and manage, and then the thing sort of flips over again into the megacity now. And so that's the four models that I structured the book around. And then I tried to link the sort of key change moments in the 50, 60 years to the cycle of oil production as it replaced coal, as Colin was talking about, and that there were certain critical moments, various wars, various embargoes, that as the price of oil got more expensive and then crashed again and then got more expensive, impacted the city, and how urbanism kind of rode, and global urbanism rode those waves around the world, and the cycles and production and models that were used shifted in as these energy crises impacted the modeling of the city. And I don't know, you have to get the book to get all the details, I can just say that. Otherwise it gets too long. And but this, for me, was something I did at the end of the book. Helen was very patient with me, gave me an extra summer, and I got to do some more diagrams, which was actually pretty key to be able to sum the thing up. And I don't know, I'm going to go through these four models just a little bit, but what I'm interested in is the sequencing of the code changes and the overlaps and how they kind of interact with each other. My idea is, as Colin said, that all of these models are co-present, and then they emerge at different times to be dominant, and what I'm interested in is the heterotopias as the places of change that handle the shift between models. And my range of heterotopias comes out of Foucault, and I'm very, very interested in the media-oriented ones, like Olympics, World's Fairs, and things like that. So let's see. This is like a little homage to recombinant urbanism, my three basic elements, and then a homage to Cedric Price. Because Cedric said there were three breakfasts you could have, with hard-boiled eggs, fried eggs, and scrambled eggs. And then I've added on the sponge frittata at the bottom here, which he didn't have. And the hard-boiled egg was the architecture, the city with the wall and the single center, very, very traditional. It could be Beijing, but it could be a European city just as easily. And then once the machines begin to interact with that, and you have industrialization, you get the fingers of development, like in the famous Copenhagen plan with the finger, the palm is the old city, and the fingers, 5 fingers of development out. And so and then if you look at Manchester in the 19th century, it has these fingers of development. London did too, until Abercrombie made the green belt, and so on. Is this okay, Michael? Yeah, okay. And then there's the fragmented metropolis, which is the scrambled egg, where you have a kind of open ground that is actually still agricultural or green, and it's not in a ring radial pattern, but it's a distributed city over a large area. And then you have these fragments that are urbanized, some of which have centers, which would be like malls or old city centers, and other of which have no center, and or some have 2 centers. So there's no single center system. It's a multi-centered system in the fragmented metropolis, which is his scrambled egg. And there was a bunch of planners, young planners in 2001, who took Cedric's thing and they called it archicita, cinecita, telecita, to do with the media that the stone architecture of the metropolis, the linear quality and organization of the fried egg, cinema and movement, and then the telecita, where the media starts to blend everything together. And then I think in the metacity, megacity model, we've got, through the media and satellite and remote sensing, we have a kind of way of looking at this gigantic area, and then we can actually blend all these four things in, and then through our handheld devices, it's the metacity, it's the informational city, so that it actually breaks down into fragments again, but it's very rhizomic, as Colin was saying. So that was a very nice piece of his intro. So, and then my idea is that these models actually layer up on each other. Now, this drawing was in Recombinant Urbanism, but it was a thumbnail. It was the size of your thumb. We won't go into quite how I got away with that, but so in this book it's a full page, but it's actually quite a nice drawing. So there's the old architecture, the compact city, the hard-boiled egg, and then the change place inside that is hidden inside the city. If you were sick and you had the plague in the medieval city, they just nailed up your door and put a red cross on it, and you died in there alone. You know, and then they came in a kind of leather suit and buried you in the church, or churchyard or whatever. So the heterotopia is inside the city, the place of change, and the city section gets quite complicated with these hidden places sometimes. And then the new city, the industrial city, is generally outside, and it's often a grid city in Europe or America. And often now in China, for instance, it'll be a grid city outside. So this morphology, it shifts from the old morphology to the new morphology. And it's Kevin Lynch, it's the machine city, the Cinecittà. And they're linked by an armature between them, which is my sort of flying saucer on the diagonal, which ties them in a binary system together. So you have a choice, but it's binary. And then in the new system, with the remote sensing and handheld devices and the mobility of the individual users, you have a much more emergent system, which is mobile and flexible. And at the same time, you do get very, very dense nodes for people to interact, which can be in either of these two cities, but also people are free to move between these two cities and out into the countryside over huge distributed cities, over huge areas, in a way that was not possible before, which is the megacity, the Asian city, so that you can have agriculture mixed inside the city, as well as industry and the old traditional city all blended in together. So there you have it. We could stop now in a way, but I'm going to go. I felt like saying, any questions? It's like, but we're going to go. And then just to look at the research I'm doing now is about the block, the super block, and the mega block. And so this is sort of leading me out of the sort of place that I was from the book. And so I'm working on the scale of the block, the scale, and then the super block, and then how you can nest super blocks inside the mega block. But the mega block is also so big, if it's open on one side, it can open out into agriculture and landscape in very surprising ways. And I'm basing this on work that I did, lessons that were taught to me by Brian McGrath, who I often work with and is also one of Helen's, he's one of my teaching partners and one of Helen's also authors. And so this model here is like a kilometer square with temples and agriculture within a block where there's sort of mega malls and offices, but also factories with housing lanes and temples with, so the city of faith, the city machine, and the Cinecittà, all blended inside this giant piece of Bangkok, is that particular model. And so, sorry, how am I doing? Okay. So, okay, going on. So now I'm going to go through the Metropolis very quickly, a little sample from the book, and then I'm going to try and end in about 2 minutes. How's that? 20 minutes? Right. So Metropolis. I had a Russian students, and they loved Moscow as a global metropolis. And so I, of course, was brought up in the age when, unless you were a red diaper ping pong playing communist member, you couldn't go to Moscow, whereas now you can. But it's the scale of this is the ring radial model of the metropolis, with the single center, and then the enormous, in this case, enormous expansion with green park areas blended in with new towns developed around the edge. And they're still continuing down to the southwest, they're still developing it. And then at the center, Lenin's tomb. So this was a global metropolis in the Cold War. This was the opposite of Washington. And the sort of mass demonstrations, so the space was made to hold 500,000 people. And then in China, Mao made his space to hold, he was in rivalry with Stalin, and to hold 1 million people. And this is the view from his balcony when he would speak to people. And the road in front there is about 100 meters wide. It's absolutely, gigantic throughway, basically. And then what happened was that originally Mao's tomb is at the back, but they demolished the gate that was there before, and Mao didn't want to be buried, he wanted to be cremated. But this space was so awkward, they built a tomb and put him in a glass case inside. It's very interesting. And so to make the space, but it's a gigantic piece of urban design in a sort of a new imperial mode. And then in Stalin's case, he made on the ring system at the intersections, there were the 7 towers. This one's for the party faithful to live in right by the Kremlin. But the university was built in a very beautiful tower. These are very heterotopic elements. They have public kind of shopping and cinemas, offices, and then apartments mixed into them. So it's a complex section. And then they're meant to be markers on the city skyline that you can use to navigate in the ring and radial pattern. And in London, where you had a similar ring radial thing with Abercrombie, the planners did Moscow scatter pattern, they called it. If you look from Hampstead Heath or somewhere and you see all these towers scattered out, that's coming from Moscow. And then they had these big parade streets radiating out, which under Khrushchev became these concrete slab towers. And then the big podium of shopping along it and the gardens. It's actually quite a nice setup. If you read it now, it's all casinos. So this is from students gave me this picture for the book. But originally it would have been shops and small offices that made this a kind of almost self-sufficient area. And then I don't know, I want to go really fast. In the West, the Soviet model was very, very influential, and in Sweden and the welfare states in Europe, which were sandwiched between Russia, the USSR, and America, so they had a blend. Sweden made this incredible Hotgörot shopping area in the old Haymarket, which is on a slope, so it can have these upper levels, and then there's a podium, like in the Russian model, with the towers on it, but they're office towers for insurance companies. There's a state theater at the end, and then a new kind of, at the other end, there's a kind of Pompidou Center that was before the Pompidou Center. And then there's a recessed access to the subway system, which is used for political demonstrations, which is very, very beautiful setup with those stepping down the hill. And then the subway goes underneath. This was an incredibly important, dense urban model, had a huge impact in America, and this is from 1951, and in Asia also. And there were also new towns built on the railway radiating out from this. So it's the metropolitan model. And of course, there was, if we were looking at mainly imperial and European models, which were based on the street, and in America there was the modern metropolis of Chicago, which is based on the skyscraper and the vertical armature of the elevator, and the profile of the business district as a symbol of modernity, in a very different way, counter to the distribution of the skyscrapers in Moscow. So there was a distinct difference between the modern metropolis of the West and capitalism and Moscow. And that the desire for the metropolis, and for that skyscraper vision is so powerful still. This is Pudong in the mist. But it's exactly the same idea of the peninsula with the towers across, in this case, from the old city. So megalopolis, I should speed up, is this, New York is just one part of Gene Gottman's 1961 book that studied, it was very ecological, it studied where the water came from, where the food and the chickens came from, where the forests were, and where the new development was. And I worked with a wonderful Cooper grad called Yuri Wegman, who redrew lots of drawings for me. And so here we've combined the water and then the urban growth with Levittown, which was like this symptomatic of the new urban morphology based on the car and oil, so that the mobile army structures for the tanks and the oil supply that they developed, the new oil fields in Venezuela and places like this, flip over and start altering the form of the city. And you have the invention by Victor Gruen and other architects of new urban forms for shopping malls, and new urban forms by housing developers on an incredibly wasteful, gigantic scale. This is Levittown in Long Island, and the lucky winner of a lottery has won a television. And so everybody's come to see them get their television, but they're being marketed these Cape Cod houses, which you could add on to garages, and the lower floor was finished, and the upper floor was do-it-yourself, fix it, with the second bathroom. And if you go back, and originally they were racially segregated, and if you go back there now, it's multi-ethnic, and not one single house has survived as it was originally developed. But this is like hundreds of hectares. This is a gigantic, wasteful development, and it's based on these cars which do like 4 miles to the gallon, and so on. But I love this picture. And then notice the very wasteful freedom for women of the electric cooking stove, the washers and the dryers, and then a modern bathroom. And the way they built these was they built a pad with the plumbing and everything in it, and then they had a framing system and outside finishes later, inside finishes. It was done they could do about 4 houses a day. It was a production line. And this is what it produced. This is Levittown. And there'd be modern schools in here. There were many, many advantages to living here. In Europe, there was a reaction to this that, yes, we've got the highways coming, but we need to have a new housing structures at the scale of the highway. This is the Smithson's 1958 Berlin Hauptstadt, city capital of Europe, idea that the East and West would be combined. And the housing is in these big slab blocks around the outside. But what I'm attracted to is these finger buildings that go between the small towers. And then there's the old buildings sort of plugging into the network. And I see this like a Jackson Pollock painting with these sort of multiple flow systems and the little plug-in towers as being very, very interesting project, and from the AA, of course. And here's the sketch. Yes, that flying saucer in the middle is a stadium, and there it is. Pretty amazing. And this Economist building is like a small fragment of this. But I don't know, I'm just going to go on a little bit. The podium, top of the podium is 40 feet up, and the department stores and shops are below, and then the cars go below that, and there's service access. There's very famous escalator drawings of how you move through this. But this is trying to integrate so the big problem for the Europeans is that they got to integrate the car inside the traditional city, whereas the Americans are just rolling it out up Long Island and up the East Coast. And of course we rolled it out too, around London and then into the Blue Banana. Notice Paris is sort of out of it. And the Ruhr Valley and Rhine Valley were inside occupied Western powers. And the Autobahn and so on was very easily structured over to the American system, the highway, and this vast network developed down the river valleys. Anyway, so we have our own version, and it has its own visual dynamics. This is the Venturi Scott Brown. The whole role of the media and communications in this isn't really highlighted, but it's there in the background, and these symbols, which are the logos for the corporations, would be known from the TV and so on. And then this new landscape of the vast space that the car opens up and then they're comparing Ville-Radieuse to a highway interchange, the scale, and then the strip in Las Vegas and so on, to Versailles. It's kind of very cheeky, but also very important that there is a new dimension and scale to the city. And at the same time, in the countries where the oil was coming from, in Brazil, where there's not an industrialized housing construction system, people are building their own self-built favelas and cities on an immense scale, and they still are. Fragmented Metropolis, I'm going to fly now. Jane Jacobs, we're not going to have the highways in our backyard. I was a student fighting against, we had demos against the London highway system coming into Camden Town. And then the fear was that you would have the Detroit happen, of the inner city ring collapse. And then this is, mental mapping. The highway is the dotted line going through by Faneuil Hall that was built and then buried, which I go on about in Recombinant. But here it's the idea that you can interview people and find out how they navigate, and how the structure of the old city can be made visible and guide you in how you work in the city. But he also worked at a motorway scale out into the suburbs. And then he wanted to preserve the historic center of the city. And this 10 years later, this was turned into a festival market, which is the model for Covent Garden. And in this same period, Walt Disney, Epcot was happening, and it's a fragmented system, but it's amazing. It's connected to the he has his own private highway system, and then he has this red dot is the AT&T Pavilion, which is a Bucky-Fuller dome that traces the history of communications from Stone Age to cell phone. The cell phone was the size of a small brick. And then there was the GM Pavilion and the GE Pavilion, so the American machinery. And then you came through, and there was the lake, which is the sea, and all the old empires, China, European empires, were around the lake. And the message was that modern technology and modern communication systems would blend all this stuff together in a Walt world. I don't know. So there's this, it's an amazing kind of heterotopic, miniature mirroring of the global system that is not yet there but will come. for 1981. And then each of the previous empires, Paris, London, had a street with the kind of markers of that empire compressed inside a simulacra. And it's reversed deliberately so you don't think you're in Venice. The things are flipped. And so in London, for me, in this book, is the archetypal, layered, but fragmented metropolis. And it comes out of my study earlier of all the West End estates and the docklands being fragmented, and then how urban actors like the Olympic Authority or Mrs. Thatcher in Canary Wharf could seize big fragments and recondition them for global use. And then we're importing from Asia these amazing mixed-use urban fragments, which Mies van der Rohe would not approve of all the mixing inside here. So it's really quite a new kind of urbanity. I made it, this is our drawing, it's much more elegant than what's actually being built. Yeah, that's the official photo. It was very interesting, well, I'll keep quiet. Getting copyright for Helen is always a problem. I'll just say that. So now I've got the megacity, metacity. The metacity, I'll just go quick, is always going out. Getting a drink.
He's back in a minute.
Okay, I'll have one too. Sorry. And the megacity, metacity story, the megacities are a kind of UN fiction of number crunching, that you have these, megacity regions of 120 million, but when you're actually in them, you never actually see them unless you're in a satellite and reading them at night. Maybe you can see them. When you experience them, you're always inside a sort of fragmented system that, in my argument, is open to the landscape. And actually, there's a big debate about megacities that only 8% of the world's population, urban population, will live in megacities. 92% of the world's urban population will live in cities of between 2 to 4 million. And that's a very different kind of proposition. And so I was mapping where the UN says the cities of 2 to 4 million will be, in contrast to where the megacities are. But of course, the growth Europe takes on, and the Middle East takes on a different pattern than Asia and Latin America. And it's interesting, New York, inside its sort of larger network, Mexico City and Los Angeles are still surviving. But almost nothing in Europe is a megacity except for Moscow. It's kind of interesting. So the scale, and Tokyo is still the biggest city in the world according to this kind of statistic. And just looking again at that new urban form that I think is being generated both by the media, remote sensing and satellite and cell structures, and then the bottom up kind of, so you have remote sensing and handheld, up close and remote working together in creating a very new kind of urban mixture that includes the landscape. And it includes fish farms, rice paddies, flat screen factories and old villages, all blended together into a new, this is in Jakarta, Indonesia, with the skyscrapers right mixed in as a kind of linear element coming from the port, mixed right in, very close together. It's called the Desakota system, the urban village system. And I'm going to pitch urban villages to Helen later tonight. And there's, in Leuven, there's a group called ASRO with Kelly Shannon and Bruno de Mulder, who have done a lot of work with the kind of water systems, agricultural systems, in river deltas, and then the sort of modernization that took place, and this is in Vietnam under the Russian influence, with a linear city coming into the old city core, and then the French had their beach resorts on the edge when it was French, and it's a sort of composite design to bring back all these things into a new kind of landscape, urban landscape of the megacity, metacity. And I'm just using their imagery. So you can see in the bottom left the Soviet slab blocks, and then the rice paddies and fish farms, and then the coast with the settlements. And this floods a lot. And they designed a new waterfront for the city that was able to flood and then survive the flood and have work in different conditions, and had various floating elements, but also parts of it that were designed to be flood, to accommodate the flood. And it's just sort of a metaphor for the way in which we're going to have to design with climate change within these megacities. And in Vietnam, it's all kind of built into the laws now that you have to expect 2-meter water rise. And then this is my Seki Vigano patch dynamic, looking at an old city in terms of just like the rice paddies are sets of patches, the industrial areas are sets of patches, and then how they mapped the different industrial areas, the different docklands, and their porosity, how dense they were as urban fabric or as landscape elements, and then what remedial action they might. Each one of these patches has a history and a story related to it, and different urban actors controlling them. And then the city is sort of, they're trying to handle these into a new narrative, and they won the competition for the city square, for this town hall, which was supposed to be demolished, but they kept the old one, made a new facade, provided the fire escapes that were missing, and then made this sort of pergola over the top with landscape elements at the side and a stream, which is used for markets and all sorts of different events. And then they also worked at Paris, and Paris is unrecognizable in their work, that the normal Haussmann ring radial city has completely disappeared into a network of patches and various dynamics of where it will flood and where it won't flood, and which areas are forested and high, other areas that are small pavilions of houses, not what you think of for Paris, these little tiny houses in gardens. And they're sort of mapping all these different patches in relation to each other, and then trying to modernize them for the climate change. This is an area that floods in the Seine Valley that is abandoned factories, which they're proposing housing on the roof and solar farms on the roof, and then public space and art space inside the abandoned factories. And well, in the book, Helen did a really good job of the printing, and you can read it, but here it's a little messy to see how they did it. And then in the little pavilion houses, the suburban houses, they had that patch also had its own contextual, if you like, or local coding, microcoding, to adjust it, that allowed for it to expand and become more dense. And then the big tower and slab blocks that also were part of this, they also had a whole recoding. So each urban system was sort of brought into a new combination. And so there I am, finished.
So, how to respond to that? Firstly, I'm reminded that Grahame and I actually shared a tutor, although by 20 years difference, which I think was Dalipur Vesely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And in some ways it's an extraordinarily apposite moment that you're here, because I think in my years in architecture, the city for a long time has fallen out of the dialogue of architectural discourses. And as we saw in a great deal in London and many other cities, urbanism was kind of given over to the realm of developers, financiers, politicians, and very few architects spoke about it. Very little was taught, very little systematic studies. So David's book, I think, is an important one because it's 5 years in the making. There's amazing scholarship and depth of knowledge he has of what I would say the principal sets of ideas in Western culture of people thinking and talking about architecture. And without David's book, it's very hard to find that kind of knowledge and map it for yourself. So it's a great kind of scholarly service, let's say, to those of us who are interested in the city. Of course, we're like two people on a landscape who started from very different directions, and we're looking at the same object, the city, but from entirely different perspectives. And strangely enough, I find myself agreeing more with him than I do with my scientific colleagues and mathematicians, biologists that I conventionally work with. My work is very different, involves very different understandings of the city. And 3 days ago, when I was asked to read this book and take part in the discussion, I thought, oh God, not another book about urban design, you know. And I found it really a very impressive book, and I urge you all to buy it. I think it's an amazing cartography of the principal ideas that have been discussed and put forward. You may, like me, not entirely be captivated by the systematization of the 4 kind of principal models of the city. Cities are very difficult to talk about for us nowadays, and I think his way of doing it is one way. There are particular where our work might coincide or overlap is on what counts as a model. We're used to the idea in architecture that a model is some sort of representation of something larger. I think you're very careful to mention a model is a set of ideas, or an idea. From my perspective, a set of ideas. In my work, of course, it's a mathematical procedure, and my work really starts from Levi-Strauss, who says a city is an artifact that encodes its biological history within its walls, and its cultural history too. The second area, I think, where the work is important, and this is an important read for people, is on ecology. I think if I do have a small critique, you're far too polite about the failures of architects to think about ecology and ecological cities, which you're careful to map. You're also overly polite in the critique of them. I myself am much more critical. And from the point of view of the evolution and origin of cities, cities were, of course, once deeply embedded in their local ecology. One of the problems we face in the world today, and particularly for your generation, is everybody has lost that sense that a city is not a universal artifact that you can put anywhere, that every ecological system and local climate needs a different morphology and has a different cultural inheritance. And I think without wanting to kind of divert too far into my own view, that's where, you know, our two worlds of thinking about the city do overlap. And the model is a very important part. The final thing is much more difficult, and I put it forward as a provocation and something perhaps to be discussed. One of the great difficulties about talking about cities is the principle of what in linguistics would call meta-language. That is, if you're a theoretician, we've now got theories about theories. Or if you're a linguist talking about meta-languages, you're trying to find a set of symbols to talk about a language. So let's say, both the cultural and the anthropological and scientific projects of the city use entirely different vocabularies, entirely different methodologies, and they seem to be discussing different things, and yet we all go home on the same bus, live in the same kind of house, and wear the same kind of clothes. And I think where the language, from a historian like Grahame, it's very important to read his book, because that will give you a handle on how the language of talking about cities has changed over since 1945. But still I find that as architects and urban thinkers, we are far outside the sets of languages that are used in other disciplines to talk about cities. So that's the kind of point I would put to you. But I would like to congratulate him on the book, and I urge you to read it. Shin is always very shy about
Thanks again, Grahame. We had a really wonderful session this morning with my unit in DIP 11 about our site in Silvertown. But I think that I'd rather not go into theoretical dimension to it. But I think the amazing thing about the book, as well as Grahame's personality, it's generosity. Because I never thought there's some urban books about city, which diversely including everything without making any hierarchical judgment, which is actually enjoyable. And I think that's what my students get this morning as a message, how we could just simply enjoy the city by reading it, at the same time appreciating we are part of the city itself. So there's one thing, it's just last September there is a big exhibition, Mori Museum in Tokyo. There is all exhibition dedicated to Metropolis. So it's actually history of Tokyo after 1945, which how city has been completely destroyed, then how the theory evolved by reconstruction of the city. But more importantly, those histories been spoke through series of important architecture. So then last part is about the tsunami effect. So almost look like whole exhibitions looking for a new start. Where shall we start when the whole city has been destroyed? Are we related to environment or ecology or infrastructures or small community or some idea of fragmented patches left behind? Then all those topics are in his book. Then it's really, really nice to, anybody have a time to go to Tokyo, please look at that exhibition and read Grahame's book, I think. And also myself is born in Tokyo and grown up in Tokyo, so I always thought city is something, as you educated in Tokyo, it's actually, city is something only designed it exists in Europe. We never thought Tokyo is something we learn from. So that is our frustration, like contemporary, like Atelier Paola, Tsukamoto, and myself, and Hitoshi Abe. We were actually same generation in the university, then we always thought, why can't we talk about Tokyo as something, a model? And took us coming out from Japan to meet somebody like Grahame's or come across the book to realizing that actually model of the Tokyo is something you learn from. Then currently, that time we talked about another counter metabolism called kind of something about erasure, something about void. So then we thought we're gonna form some little group called anti-metabolist somehow, which are too ambitious. We couldn't start it, or we started formally, but end up becoming quite interesting, which again we find lots of reference, which are really encouraging from his book. So anyway, so I only compliment his work. So there is no kind of question to throw back to you, but then thank you very much.
I think we're going to sit at the table and we're going to have a little questions from the audience. Is that okay? We have some staged questions, maybe, I think. So I hope. So let's see what happens. Michael, you're going to... Shin, come. Yeah. I suppose.
So this isn't actually staged. I was thinking of it through the presentation. Not so much a question, really something I'd like you to elaborate upon, Grahame. Thinking about the images from your thesis that you showed, and when we had a conversation earlier today, and you showed these, I made a comment that in the kind of references you're making even that early within those images, let's call them for the moment, to more or less contemporary practices, to Team 10 and to archigram, that there is what we would say is kind of like a meta-discursive